Hey everybody, welcome to The Watch Inquiry, a journalistic look into the watch world past, present and future, with me, Tim Barber.
And me, Chris Hall.
The question we're digging into today is a somewhat alliterative one, namely, is collaboration culture killing creativity in watchmaking?
Or has it already?
Yeah, indeed.
We know it's a bold charge.
Yeah.
I think there's a decent case to be made. And this is a huge topic. It's going to take us off in some interesting tangents as we go through the episode. But we're going to keep coming back to this main idea of what does it mean for creativity from within the watch industry.
All right, let's take it away.
Let's get into what we're talking about. So, over the last decade or so, we have witnessed the rise of the collab design. Now, these watches and partnerships, they attract, I think, a huge amount of skepticism in collector circles, but they are persistent, you might say ubiquitous, and it can feel like they're almost a drug the industry now can't wean itself off. And we wanted to examine what role these collab watches play and ask what it means for creativity in luxury watchmaking that the industry is so dependent on them. And I think before we go any further, I want to establish sort of what we are and aren't talking about here, because this is a sprawling topic. It can be something that means different things to different people, and it isn't necessarily helped by the language sometimes used by the brands.
No, partnership. We have done a partnership with so-and-so, which is that a collaboration, or is it two brands playing together in the same sandpit? Yeah,
exactly. And this is sort of partly it's because sometimes, and understandably so, I think companies are quite coy about sort of the commercial nature of these relationships, but we're not going there just yet. At one end of the spectrum, you've got the limited edition partnership watch.
Girard-Perregaux does a green Laureato with Aston Martin, for instance.
Yeah, football club watches are sort of a great example of this. The club crest goes on the dial or the back, and it's strap colour to match the kit.
Yeah.
Now, these can be interesting. Certainly, some people can find them interesting if it speaks to your tribe. They can be boring.
There's almost never been a good football club watch, I would say.
I think definitely.
Maybe with the lone exception of the Jean Richard Arsenal all red Gooners watch with a picture of a cannon.
Did it have Gunnosaurus on the back?
Well, whatever happened to?
I might have to do that as a fourth wheel. The best football club watches. But like I say, these can be done sort of with care or not. They can be good or bad, but I would argue they're not really collaborative in the true meaning of the word. Yeah. Then you have the next sort of category along a spectrum, if you like, which I think loosely encompasses things like retailer-specific limited editions, tie-ins with other major luxury brands. Do you remember when Hublot did a Berluti leather?
Oh yeah, they had a leather dial. Yeah.
And the watch brand here is probably sort of very much the dominant partner in terms of sort of the balance of creative input, but there is something from the other side as well.
No, I mean, kind of like your first category, this is about client acquisition, isn't it? Getting your brand in front of new audiences and giving your existing clients, new angles and experiences and crossover interest and things, which is a necessary part of running a luxury brand. The thing is, creatively, this often tends to have the sort of the feel of the committee about it, doesn't it?
Well, perhaps this is not where the greatest sort of risks are taken.
Okay.
And then we have the third category, which is really the group of watches I think we're going to spend most of our time talking about in this episode, where a watchmaker, watch company has worked with an outside individual or still company, potentially a studio, that is actually bringing a genuine creative input to the process. Designers, architects, artisans, fashion designers, graphic illustrators, you name it.
Graffiti artists.
There's been graffiti artists and on and on. But I would call out, again, from front of mind, Samuel Ross for Hublot, also Daniel Arsham, Matthew Williams for AP, Tadao Ando for Bulgari. Yeah. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. So this is the realm we really want to dig into. But before we do those, there's another category to sort of mention because it will become relevant when watch brands collaborate with each other.
Right, yeah.
Indie watchmakers teaming up together. H. Moser do a bit of this. MB&F do a bit of this. Louis Erard, Alain Silberstein has sort of out of nowhere developed a second add to his career.
He's almost more like second at this point, which is to say that
no longer makes his own watches.
He doesn't make his own watches. He brings a recognizable creative edge to a watch brand. And
I mean, for anyone who doesn't know, of course, Alan Silberstein had his own brand in the late 80s, early 90s. He was an architect before that, but his watch design's very, very unusual, Bauhaus inspired, kind of postmodernism in watch form, big primary colors, geometric shapes and things. And so he was very cool, kind of part of the rise of fresh independent watchmaking in that era, and then for the past decade has been a collaborator who specifically brings a sort of Silberstein style, and therefore also with it a kind of a credibility. He's appreciated by collectors. It helps a brand tell a kind of fresh story while also seeming canonical in a way.
But I mean, it's very, very specific, and you could almost be a Silberstein completist at this point if you've got the clock, the MB&F, the Louis Erard,
Bell
the
Ross.
Bell and Ross. Yeah,
so many pieces. I'd love to see that actually, because there's something quite interesting about that fusion of a watchmaker who was perceived by many as ahead of his time, and then the coming wave of this sort of fondness for collabs and how he's managed to become a part of that.
Yeah.
But in the field of watch brand to watch brand collaboration, you obviously sort of shouldn't overlook the Moon Swatch, which is the biggest cross-brand collaboration in recent times. And for me, these generally different in that they create something which usually, I feel anyway, is more than the sum of its parts. And they demonstrate, especially on the indie level, they demonstrate creativity within the watch world. So bearing in mind our initial question, what's happened to creativity, this is kind of a special case.
Okay.
Now something else I think also is quite sort of crucial to say up front, and we're not necessarily here to rule on matters of taste.
Yeah.
The sort of the world of the collab watch, by definition, tends to push us into the more polarizing corners of the industry, and we're not here to ask, are these good watches, or to litigate personal taste.
You see, I think we're not looking to legislate on particular collaborations and whether they're good or bad, but I think it does speak to one side of collaboration culture, which, as you say, if it pushes something into being a sort of an instant hit, there's an impermanence to it that in some ways I think is what makes it polarizing for people who really love watches. For instance, a tie-up between Zenith and what's that skiwear brand that it does these ceramic watches with?
Fuzalp. Zenith and Fuzalp.
Yeah, they did a white ceramic and a black ceramic Defy with a slightly sort of interesting, energetic design. They're quite nice. I thought they would be nice as standalone Zenith watches, but it somehow means that as a watch, as a design, it means less. There is something inherently reductive about the process.
I think you're touching on something that is quite important, this sort of a risk that's baked into the sort of structural premise. As we said in the intro, that this is
much better expressed. Thank you.
A bit of it. Sorry, I had time to think about it while you were talking.
Wittering, yeah.
But the idea that this is a bit of a drug that the industry's got itself hooked on. We weren't necessarily going to go in this direction, but actually I think it is quite useful. It's been discussed quite a bit in the last couple of years, the extent to which the watch industry has sort of yoked itself to the hype train, and how that has, again, I would say aided and abetted in fact, entirely sort of fueled by social media, has catapulted us into a world where the frequency of product drops has to be high, therefore their lifespan is short. And that's a very chicken and egg sort of relationship. But you could also tie this into the demise of the watch fair and the always on product launch cycle, and these are all sort of areas that I think can feed into this. But yes, you've put your finger on something, which is to say that these collaborations do carry with them an inherent level of alienating people as much as they will win over a certain target demographic.
The inherent risk is not the creative risk, but it's the dilution.
It's a brand management
of the value that you have as a brand.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it might not sound so satisfactory to say it, but when it's done well, it can work, and when it isn't, it can't.
And all right. So you're fine. That's it. We've done the podcast. That's it.
The point I want to sort of bring us back to is, what does it mean for the industry that collab culture has become the default way to make a watch interesting? And what does it say about watch brands? And we do mean mainstream volume watch brands at this point, and I'll explain why later. What does it say about their ability to create and to excite us? If to do that, they have to look elsewhere for that spark and that injection of energy.
All right, I mean, maybe it's worth here just jumping in with some examples of, I suppose, collaborations that have been broadly additive when you think of the brand, rather than reductive, that have given a creative direction in some respect or another. So I'm thinking, for instance, I mean, Hublo's done a few. It's worked with various artists and things. I mean, one that I really actually quite like is the ones with Richard Orlinski.
Yes. He's a sort of sculptor.
So he makes these sculptures of gorillas and other animals that are in bright primary colours, and
they're sort of faceted and geometric, aren't they? And
that's right. They have this sort of
crystalline almost.
That's it.
Yeah.
And the watches have that as well, so that it kind of refashions the Hublot blueprint into something with a lot of facets that are strangely shaped, and they come out in these ceramic colours. They're bright red, bright green, with these contrasting surfaces and very angular. I mean, as an artist, I've got no interest in him at all. I think he's highly thought of by people who think highly of things like that, but I quite like the look of the watches, and it's not something I'd wear, but I think it's, as a design, it really has added a fresh direction.
It's evolved Hublot's style, but in line with sort of what we were saying earlier, it's required that outside influence to bring this to Hublot and go, hey, you could be this.
If Hublot was simply to make a watch looking like that, would it have legitimacy? Would people buy into it?
Well, I think that's actually a point that we will have to return to, is what it means to consider whether a brand would have launched these things themselves and what it's like when brands today launch new designs.
Okay.
I'll put another example straight into the mix, though, and that is a very, very different end of the sort of watch market, but Seiko's Rowing Blazers collab.
Yeah.
And I find this really interesting because I just think it's
preppy colours.
Preppy, yeah, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't have brought these two things together, but when you see the end result...
Yeah, what was they've done this a couple of times, limited editions.
There are quite a few pieces now.
Eric Wynn, the dealer, was involved in this, wasn't he?
Yes, definitely Eric's involved. Jack Carlson's the guy, isn't he? And I'm sorry, Jack Carlson has a business partner whose name has temporarily escaped me, but these two guys set up Rowing Blazers.
Right.
Which is the sort of New York-based preppy clothing label type thing.
Right.
And then they've gone and worked with Seiko on watches which have brightly coloured dials and sort of little flag type motifs around the hour markers.
Yeah.
Echoes of sort of Louis Vuitton in some of that as well for me.
Right.
Those sort of painted flag type things. And again, at a price point and in a sort of style that have been quite hard to object to.
Yes, and it brings a kind of a liveliness and a pep to what is otherwise the tool watch's tool watch.
Yeah, and the timing was clever in that the Seiko 5 Sports had a few years previously been brought back, and everybody had been quite keen on that.
Yeah. Well, on that note, okay, I'm going to throw one more at you, which is Louis Erard.
Ah, yeah.
Because this is a brand that has been around for a long time, as not really very well known. It was kind of like the Swiss Christopher Ward before there was Christopher Ward, which is that it was doing it was kind of like the specific entry level into mechanical Swiss watchmaking, and Manuel Emch kind of took it on a few years ago and has relaunched it through the power of collaborations. In other words, it's using successive collaborations with various people. We talked about Alan Silberstein and a few others to elevate your idea of what Louis Erard is. So that's a brand that is using collaboration as its entire sort of brand strategy, really.
Yeah, it's no exaggeration to say it transformed people's perceptions of Louis Erard.
Well, it meant they'd heard of it
as a company.
For a lot of people, it meant they'd heard of it. But I wonder if it has. My question is, yes, it's made those collaboration watches well known and sought after, but has it lifted up Louis Erard away from the collaborations, or has it almost pushed non-collaboration Louis Erard sort of back into the shadows by making the collaboration stand out so much that away from the collaboration, what is Louis Erard after that?
I think that's a very interesting question to ask. I think
we don't know the numbers.
We don't know the inside story there, but on the one hand, I would say that as well as pursuing these collaborations, I think what's fair to say is that Louis Erard, Manuel's sort of guidance did see them overhaul the core collections. They did get rid of some of the dustier, older sort of styles. So I think they do at least look a bit more contemporary these days.
Okay, fair enough. All right, so that's 3 quite varied and different examples of where creativity has been brought by collaboration, and that in a way that couldn't necessarily happen within a brand on its own.
And most examples that you could think of fit this pattern, in that Orlinsky works with Hubler. That's a monogamous relationship. This is how it tends to go. Contracts are signed or whatever. But there are others who are sort of the multi-collaborators who have become these kind of focal points, these hubs of collaboration, if you like, around whom an awful lot of creativity has essentially sort of funneled through these quite sort of small hubs. You look at the work of Second and Bamford Watch Department. One of the earliest people I think who sort of fits this mold was a guy called James Thompson. Many of our listeners will be very familiar with. Operates the Black Badger material sort of studio out of Sweden, makes wonderful avant-garde rings and that kind of thing, and now works for Archanaut watches.
And he really made his name through working with MB&F.
Exactly. HMX I think was the watch. There's a driver style watch with sort of lots of bright coloured lume, because that was James's sort of area of expertise at the time. And then he said after that he was swamped with requests from other mainstream watch brands who just wanted the same thing. They want to sort of copy paste stamp that on their brand and move on. And he said he had to say no to far more offers than he could say yes to, and be careful about managing his own sort of brand. But some of the projects he did do, he was very candid in saying he felt afterwards that they hadn't actually listened, they hadn't really taken on board what he could bring to the proceedings. And he said he looks at these projects now and thinks nothing of what I brought made it through to the final sort of version, but yet it was still sort of sold as having his name attached to it. The mainstream watchmaker, he said, is buying a bit of cool. Okay, they just want to pick up a bit of this magic fairy dust, sprinkle it on their products, and sort of move on again. And this is what kind of, I think, can generate quite a cynical attitude towards these things.
Yes, the application of fairy dust to the exclusion of being able to do anything interesting in your mainstream lines as well. I mean, I think one can look at these kind of collaborations and go, but is originality getting siloed into this collaboration stream?
Well, I think this might be a good time to talk about what it's like when mainstream watchmakers launch entirely new designs anyway, because this is, I mean, you can hear the smiles breaking out on our faces, because this is fascinating.
So what you're saying is that it is relatively tricky for mainstream brands to bring new and original creative ideas into their watches.
100%. Okay. Let's cast our minds back to the launch of Audemars Piguet's Code 1159. That was flamed. The takes were savage. Yeah. It's changed, it's developed, and I think it has improved in many ways.
It's settled down. They've sorted out a lot of the issues.
Yeah. It wasn't the only one by any means. Now, Langer & Son had brought out the Odysseus. The reaction was not positive, not by a long way.
I think, yes. I also think that the Odysseus is, on its own merit, a relatively decent design, whereas the Code 1159 was on its own merit a massively overwrought, overthought design.
Vacheron Constantin's 56. That's a perfectly nice watch, but it's let's say it's probably been a lukewarm success at best.
Underrated, I think.
Yeah, fair enough. But again,
I like it, but they did too many versions of it all at once.
Contrast that with, I sort of remember, I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Omega's CEO Reynold Eastman a few years ago, about 5 years ago now probably, in which he said that Omega, under his tenure, is not in the business of launching new designs, new watches. Anything Omega does has to fit within its established pillars.
Well, is his point being that we have Seamaster, we have Speedmaster, we have Constellation, and etc., and there shall be no new pillars at any time?
I mean, yes, it was fairly unambiguous as to how he said it at the time. Now, obviously, that was a while ago, but I still felt it was telling.
Yeah.
And it all sort of feeds back to this idea of, okay, well, it's hard for brands, legacy brands in particular, to introduce brand new things.
But why is it hard? I mean, just to ask a question on that, why is it hard for them to put a nameable, visible creative force within what they do. In other words, Genta is the most famous designer, but he's one of very few. Emmanuel Guite's another one, Octavio Garcia, they all used to be at AP. But
you've got people like Eric Giroux, there are half a dozen others, perhaps.
There's a few, but they're not people where, for instance, in other areas of the luxury world and design, the vision of the creative genius or the artist, the designer, is to the fore, is celebrated. And in some ways, with watches, you're playing with such a constrained format that is maybe slightly more difficult to be that creative with. But then we're showing lots of examples where brands, through a collaboration, are outsourcing not just the design, but the association with a competent designer who you can actually name and associate the watch with in a way that they won't do in-house. And I wonder why that is. We have the hero CEOs, but why are Swiss watch brands so reticent to promote creativity within them?
I think that's a very, very good question. And my sort of stock answer to it has always been that I feel that there's a sense of just not wanting to pull focus from some sort of overarching or sort of primary sort of brand narrative, even if it does seem a bit detrimental. I had a conversation with Manuel Emch of Louis Erard and many other things recently. I'm quoting now, he says, I think this is a very relevant point. And he says, I think it's a key problem of the industry today, the fact that you have a CEO, he says, that does everything, or at least pretends he does everything. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that, there is no educational, vocational sort of pathway for this, if you like, people entering the industry. He said there's no special education for it. There was not even a watch design school. There was a jewellery design course in Neuchâtel, which even that no longer exists, he says. And there is no school, here I'm quoting, no school that creates or that nurtures creativity. He says again that when he was working for Romain Jerome, another massively collaborative watch brand on his CV, he lobbied the sort of universities to try and introduce this again, because if there are these frameworks, these pathways don't exist to bring people into the industry, he says what you get instead is watchmaking for and by business people who are going to manage it efficiently from a commercial perspective, but not necessarily have the creative background that you need. And he says, and you've already talked about, watchmaking it's not fast-moving consumer goods. It's closer to art and artisanship in many ways.
I mean, you could give Romain Jerome his old brand as an example of something that went too far in the other direction, of course, and was all creative extroversion with too little to underpin it. Although, I mean, I think it's obviously it went out of business in 2020, but I think you could say that its issues were pretty deep-seated and a whole other story. But I mean, it is, I suppose, one side of the coin to the argument that, if you rely on spreadsheets to determine your product strategy, frankly, rather than any kind of creative gut instinct, the handbrake is bound to stay on. So that when you do want to juice things up a bit, you have to import the juice from outside rather than what we want to see, which is it being generated from within the brand itself. On the other hand, is there a real market or appetite for watches that push things a bit more anyway? Or is it just us and our unreasonable journalistic demands to be entertained and amused? Maybe it is. But before we dive into that, let's go to a break.
This episode of The Watch Inquiry is brought to you in partnership with Watch Insight, a new data-driven analytics platform for anyone working in the watch industry. As journalists, we're always looking for reliable sources of information that help us make sense of trends. Watch Insight pulls detailed product information from dozens of brands, giving us an incredibly useful overview of what's being launched. It's also a powerful tool for anyone in PR and marketing, retail, the pre-owned market, or even after-sales care. You can track press and influencer coverage, monitor social sentiment, compare reviews with your competitors, and find out what's selling where and for how much. To find out more about what Watch Insight could do for your business, visit watchinsight.ch.
Welcome back. Chris, we're digging into watch world collaboration culture and what it says about the propensity among brands to bring forwards really original designs and creative ideas themselves.
Yeah.
And if we were somewhat lamenting that before the break, there are, of course, exceptions. And one brand you have to mention where there is a very strong and, let's say, empowered creative force, and actually some good collaborations, is Bulgari.
So Fabrizio
Buonamassa, the watch world's dapper don, is the creative force behind Bulgari's watch division. Of course, he's the guy behind the Finissimo and plenty else, and a well-known figure in the watch world.
Yeah.
And with Bulgari, you not only have some quite noteworthy collaborations, like the Finissimos with the Japanese architects Tadao Ando and Katsuo Sejima, which have been beautiful, refined and quite different. You also have those tremendous MB&F tie-ups, a couple of those so far that go into that special brand-on-brand category that you mentioned earlier, Chris. But you also have this interesting situation where Bulgari is actually collaborating with Fabrizio himself in terms of those dials that have his own sketches on
That's
them.
true. I hadn't thought about it like that.
and so his handiwork, because of course he does all these, if you ever sit down with him, it takes about 30 seconds for him to start sketching out watch dials, and he does it on Instagram and things as well, and it's always kind of amazing to watch. And now that's become part of the lingua franca of Bulgari limited edition designs, with these series of watches that effectively carry his pencil marks as their dial indications.
Yeah. What I think is interesting to ask about that then, or sort of arising from that, is to sort of come back to our central question and go, well, is there or isn't there a strong appetite for new styles? First of all, the Octo Finissimo is perhaps the shining example we've forgotten of a brand new watch design of our generation. I mean, we've done an episode this series called Game Changers where we talk about it in those terms. And I think you can look at Hermes, Louis Vuitton. They do not have centuries-long history as watch companies.
Okay.
They're established legacy luxury brands, but they are relative newcomers to the mainstream watch space.
Yeah, for sure.
And this has given them the freedom and the legitimacy to introduce brand new designs, and they've been rapturously received. Okay, so case in point are Hermes's HOA and Cut models, and I would say what Louis Vuitton's done with the Tambour and the Escale.
Yeah, they can be lighter with it. They're not bound by these kind of traditions, and also a kind of freshness and creativity is in their DNA as luxury brands who move in the fashion world and jewelry world, these other areas.
Yeah,
they are by their nature, particularly Hermes, required to be creative. That is what they are. That is their brand element. Whereas with watch brands, they are required to some degree to be watch brands and not to step outside the lane of what that can mean creatively.
Yeah, and I sort of call this the heritage trap, if you like.
Right.
And what I mean by that is that as the luxury watchmaking industry re-established itself around the turn of the 80s, 90s, it was forced to create a new identity for itself that depended entirely or almost entirely on the sort of veneration of tradition, and that's been extremely successful, but it has also resulted in effectively brands constructing a sort of prison for themselves outside of which they now cannot operate. And earlier on I said that it was important and relevant that the indie brands are perhaps exempt from this sort of thesis. And here's why I think. It's not because they are independent so much, although that definitely helps. It's because they are also, by definition, young. Mm-hmm. They're not legacy brands. They're not bound by this heritage trap I've just outlined. I think anything younger than 40 years old, so Hublot also fits quite neatly into that, has a freedom that others don't.
Yes, I mean, by the same degree, I long to see a brand like Vacheron Constantin embracing some of what made it so interesting in the 1950s, say, with designs that were really out there. Now, of course, that was a function of the time. I don't want to see it simply recreating those. Okay, it's always nice when it does something in its historic collection, but I'm wanting it to express some of that freedom, to be expressive again.
But this is the thing, let me jump in, because I think that's a really commonly expressed idea that people really want to see that kind of thing come again. But I question whether it's even possible, because you're talking about creating the sort of economic and cultural conditions that led that to happen in the first place. But I think, not to get too philosophical about it, but I think you have to look at now the world we live in as a sort of post-modern, hugely self-referential age. And what I mean by all this is to say that we don't exist in a world where it's necessarily in anyone's interests to be completely new and to take risks all the time, as it is to, in some way or other, repackage what has gone before. Now, our version of that in the watch world has been heritage revival styles and trends, etc., from the 50s to the 70s, as discussed.
Yeah.
And I think you can compare and contrast the car world, which actually continues to move forward and shape its own future.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the car is a current contemporary product of this age and will be for some time.
Yes, there's few occasions when car brands make something that in some ways harks back to earlier eras. They always look daft.
They do it sort of as a sideline for purists and collectors, and that does have a crossover into the watch world. But it really,
I don't mean those sort of recreation models, but new car designs that express a little bit of an old something. I mean, you do see them occasionally, but they always look absolute clunkers. So as you say, car design has to keep moving forwards, but watch design, in some ways, I suppose watch design was moving forwards with digital watches and smartwatches, but we are in an inherently contradictory, retro, outmoded industry. That's part of what makes it what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the watch world, effectively the luxury, the mechanical watch world, if you like, detached itself from the sort of the arc of progress and relevance in the 1990s.
Yeah, but then something like Renaissance shows that you can be creatively new even within that.
That's a great point. There are those that have almost sort of defied this and sort of found a way around.
And they're quite often designer-led brands. I mean, look at Urwerk with Martin Fry.
Yeah.
Renaissance with Benoit Mintiens. Okay, Max Busser isn't specifically a designer, but he's certainly a sort of very, very creative visionary. Yeah. And so I lump him in with that, as well as being an excellent entrepreneur. But I think that these people who are bringing something new to the language of watch design because they come from a creative background, can you imagine them being empowered to do that within the structures of a larger brand? Can you imagine an IWC bringing in someone to say, with the blank piece of paper remit, we need to bolster who we are, we need to do something new, we need a watch that is not a Portuguesa, that is not a Da Vinci or a Portofino or a pilot's watch. We're going to do something new, blank sheet of paper, come up with something that's going to make us exciting.
No, I absolutely
I'd love to see that, but who wouldn't love to see that? It could probably fail.
I think that's the problem.
There's a need, but we need it as an industry. We need newness. I mean, we talk about the independent brands. So I spoke to Guy Beauvais, who's a designer who for a long time was overseeing Chopard. He's the genius who had the Ferdinand Berthoud FE1 watch looked, which is so fantastic. But he's done multiple watches at Breitling, at Tag Heuer, where he was latterly.
Yeah.
And he was saying really that in some ways the independent brands who, as you describe, have the leeway to be creative, they are now the ones laying down the gauntlet to the mainstream brands. They are the ones who are moving the language of watch design forwards. And that's a gauntlet that the mainstream brands need to start responding to. Because let's face it, we are in straitened economic times. The industry is hurting, so we're in the downward part of the cycle. The collab culture that we're talking about, which is really sort of something that reached a zenith during the pandemic and in the sort of year or two after that, has become oversaturated, I would say. And I think that there is a real vacuum of creativity that is needing to be filled.
It's interesting you say that. I think my conversation with Manuel Emch, he also ended on a positive note by saying that he thinks there are young watchmakers now coming to the fore. He cited the more sort of traditional high-end watchmakers like Rexepi, Silvampino. He said that I think over the next few years we might see a knock-on effect of that wave of independent watchmaking coming to the fore might actually force a new appraisal of creativity and the need to be creative. No, I think there's definitely reason to be cheerful. Sort of if you go hunting for creativity, or you ask where creativity currently lives in the watch world, I don't know if I 100% agree with you that the sort of collab culture's on. Well, maybe you didn't mean this, but the collab culture has peaked. I think in the watch world things tend to stay. Maybe they outstay their welcome quite a long time sometimes. But I also thought when you were describing, the sort of the need for the mainstream watch brands to respond, as Guy Beauvais sort of put it to you, my sort of cynical response is, will they respond by doing what we've so effectively asked them here to do, which is be creative on their own, or will they act according to type and snap up this independent talent, collab with it, and look to just continue to sort of leech off the outside sources of creativity for their own needs? It may not be the worst way to do it. It may not be such a terrible outcome as I'm implying with words like leech, but obviously it's always, as you say, it's lower risk, therefore it's probably what they will do. But I do wonder whether we are destined to live in a world where creativity will permanently bubble away on the fringes and occasionally be sucked into the mainstream, have its moment, and then sort of be ejected again.
If you look at the history of watch design, we've been through these moments of great kind of creative flowerings. You had the late 1920s, early 1930s, sort of the early days of wristwatches where people were trying everything every which way. You had the 1950s, post-war era, where things went beautiful and designy, and indeed there were collaborations with jewelry designers and all kinds of people bringing their influence to bear, and I suppose even the 1970s was particularly crazy, and then you had the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, where I think in a way you could sum it up with the idea that postmodernism came into watch design,
right,
and it started kind of reflecting its ideas back on itself in bizarre new ways, and you ended up with things like the Ballon Bleu from Cartier on the one hand and Urwerk and MB&F on the other. But since really 2008, 2009, the great crash, we've been stuck in a kind of whirlpool of endless retroism, whether it's been about retro 1940s, 50s military watches, or whether it's been retro dive watches, black bays and things, or whether it's been retro bracelet watches of the 1970s. There's this kind of like endlessly retro vortex, which is why things like the Bulgari Octo Finissimo or the Hermes H08 stand out because they are not simply exercises in retro, and even watches that are ostensibly quite forward facing can seem incredibly derivative when they become yet another open worked sporty avant-garde, but it isn't really idea. We need new ideas to jolt us out of this endless retro repetitiveness. Whether that can only come from collaborating with people outside the watch industry, maybe that's the case. I'd like to see those people brought into the watch industry and empowered within it, rather than this sense that everything is always being sort of outsourced and dumped out because it's in some way too challenging to welcome it from the inside.
Yes, and I think it's fair to say that people are talking about a sort of new appreciation, the coming again of the dress watch and of elegant, slim, shaped and sort of somewhat opulent watchmaking. We've definitely seen.
Yeah, it's the counter reaction to the boring bracelet sports lux thing.
And as you've already mentioned, this is inevitably being spearheaded by some independent players. Now, perhaps the key question here in terms of the short-term future of creativity for mainstream watchmaking is whether it will respond to that, the need to sort of pivot to something dressier.
I think only if the market demands it, and I think that at the moment that market is very niche, but it's also quite high profile, and it's something that they can get a lot of uplift. I think that even Patek putting a bit of focus back on the golden lips with a wonderful golden mesh bracelet shows a response to that. Well,
look, we promised a sprawling conversation, and I don't think we've disappointed, but I think we've delivered on that. I came here prepared to effectively condemn creativity as already dead, buried and forgotten, and for collab culture not to have been the cause, but simply the sort of after effects of what happens when creativity has been stifled for other reasons. The last 5 minutes of this conversation may have given me renewed optimism to think that actually we might not need to be so pessimistic after all.
I think, it's that sort of age-old question of is it a bug or is it a feature? And in some ways, I do think it's both, collab culture. I think that there are examples where it works because it balances out on both sides. Richard Mille making Ferrari watches entirely makes sense. They are the equivalent of each other. And whereas Breitling making watches with a skateboard, sorry to come back to that again, makes no sense to me because they are not the equivalents of each other. There is an imbalance in brand power, in brand messaging, and in everything else in that, and so it just seems opportunistic. And maybe that's one of the key words, that so much collaboration seems opportunistic rather than creative.
Yes, or strategic even.
Yes.
Short term sort of, what can we do? What everyone else is collaborating with something, crikey, we better grab something before we feel outflanked.
Yeah, and frankly, the watch industry has no shortage of strategy, but it maybe has a shortage of creativity at its heart, and that's where there needs to be energy. And I think it's really interesting what Manuel Emch says to you about this need to train people in watch design and to make that a focal point and to take the grey suits at the top of these brands and say, you do not have to be the only spokesperson, you do not have to be the sole figurehead. Why not have a creative figurehead? Why not look to the fashion world, to the rest of the luxury world, to the car world, and go, creative design is an incredibly important factor, and we can actually use it to build brand power, to build desire into our products.
Perfectly put. I want to end with one final thing he said to me, and one other ray of hope he sent my way, which was to highlight the arrival of Nicolas Beau as Richemont Group CEO, a man, he said, with great creative instincts, and he highlighted that might be a sort of positive sign for the future.
Well, yes. So Nicolas Beau, who was in charge of Van Cleef & Arpels, which has done incredible things just from a business point of view in the past few years, and made some phenomenal watches. And he's now the new CEO of Richemont Group overall. And Gregory Kissling going to Breguet, he is a product man. And I think to see a specific product person rather than a marketing person or a salesperson in charge of a brand, you need to see more of that. We are at a time in the watch industry where product is much more important than anything else, I think.
Yeah, and these are individuals, and I think you've put it brilliantly already, and I think it'd be lovely for it to be the norm and not the exception for the creative director to be a key figure in any brand at any time, anywhere.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, this is a rich topic, and it'll keep inspiring more conversation. Thanks very much for listening. Do obviously like and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear some feedback on what you make of this particular subject. And please do join us again on the next episode of The Watch Inquiry.
Thank you.